Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Has he reviewed Table 1 in the latest report from the 2025 Taskforce? If so, does he stand by his statement that the wage gap with Australia is reducing?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, yes and yes, and if the member takes a look at Table 1, he will see that it doesn't refer to wages.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, does he stand by his statement that, and I quote, "a fundamental purpose of our government is to narrow the wage gap between ourselves and Australia," end quote? If so, does he accept that the 2025 Taskforce actually shows that he's failing?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, yes, I do stand by that statement, and no, we don't accept that about the 2025 Taskforce. In the shorter term, the measure of real after-tax wages is showing that the gap is closing, but the member needs to keep in mind that the government has had to deal with two substantial issues. One is the economic mismanagement of the previous Labor government that left this economy in the mess, and that was followed by a global recession. And in that context, we have made a very good start.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Leader of the Opposition.
How does the Prime Minister reconcile that answer with the explicit statement by the Taskforce, and I quote, "We do not see any realistic possibility that the gap in real per capita income has narrowed in the last year"?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, it's curious to hear that member quoting Don Brash and Bryce Wilkinson.
Order. Now, I say to the Minister that I've let him get away with an earlier question claiming certain policies were the policies of the opposition and then dumping on them. That question was a perfectly fair question because the task force is a task force established by the government. There's no political in asking the Minister about statements contained in the task force report. The member is not being political, and he doesn't need to give the questioner a lecture about those sort of things. The Minister should answer the question. The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, I disagree with the task force. They have not taken account of the decade of damaging economic management of the previous government or the global recession. And in that context, to achieve an increase in real after-tax wages has been quite an achievement. There's no doubt at all that if we followed the policies of the previous government, New Zealand's economic performance would continue dropping like a stone.
Chris Tremaine.
Thank you. To the Minister, how has real after-tax wage growth been tracking in New Zealand compared to Australia?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, between September 1999 and September 2008, real after-tax wages in New Zealand grew by only 3% in that 9-year period, compared to 19% in Australia. So the wage gap blew out substantially. Since September 2008, real after-tax wages have grown 8% in New Zealand compared to 5% in Australia. So the wage gap has narrowed slightly. As I said before, we have started a long way behind Australia, handicapped by a decade of economic mismanagement, and this is just one small gain.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Supplementary question, Mr.
Order.
Speaker. Can he name any independent economic commentator that accepts his spin that the wage gap with Australia is narrowing?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, the calculations the government has done on real after-tax wages are based on the statistical series legislated by the Labor government.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, you'll understand that the question was straightforward. I asked him if he could name one independent economic commentator that accepted his view on the wage gap narrowing. That has not addressed the question.
I must say I have considerable sympathy for the Honourable Leader of the Opposition. It's just unfortunate he added the last bit about spin on because if the member had cut his question short to that first part, I've insisted on the Minister answering it. Once the last part was added, it makes my job hard. The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, any commentator who looks at the statistics used to calculate national super will come to the same conclusion as us. And I can't name one commentator who believes. I can't name one commentator who believes that following Labor's policies would do anything but send us to the bottom of the OECD table.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister name one independent economic commentator that agrees with his position that the wage gap with Australia is narrowing?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, as I said before, any commentator who looks at the real after-tax wage series
Order. The member on this occasion asked a very specific question. The answer may be the member can't, but he shouldn't rabbit on about stuff that is not the subject of the question. Order. I'm on my feet. Standing orders are very clear about that. Information should not be included in answers that is not necessary to answer the question. And the ministers, I've been pretty generous to the minister in allowing me to get away with a lot of comment about opposition's policies. The opposition has now asked a very straight question to the government minister, or the Prime Minister on this occasion. The minister's answering on his behalf. He should answer the question. The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, any commentator who looks at the facts on real after-tax wages will have to come to the conclusion that the gap has closed.
Order. The member, if I heard the question correctly, and do forgive me if I'm wrong, asked the Prime Minister whether he can name any credible commentator who agreed or whatever, who believed the the wage gap, or whichever it was that the member used, with Australia was closing. Now, it may be the Minister can't name one, but he should answer the question asked. And there's nothing wrong with not being able to name one, but it is not within standing orders to include other information that is not the subject of the question asked. And I've allowed a fair bit of licence. The Minister has dumped several times on the opposition, claimed if their policies were still being pursued, the country would be... Now, in fact, in one of those answers was to a question from one of his own colleagues, which is not, in my view, the way questions from colleagues should be used, just to dump on the opposition. Now the opposition has asked a straight question. I believe they deserve an answer. The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think any commentator has looked at those figures, and when they do look at them, they will be forced to the correct conclusion. Real after-tax wages grew by 3% in 9 years under the previous government, and they've grown by 8% in 2 years under this government.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Which of the apparently contradictory statements is correct? The statement in the National Act Confidence and Supply Agreement that sets out closing the income gap with Australia as being a, quote-unquote, a concrete goal, or Mr. Key or Mr. English's more recent statement that says that this is merely an aspirational goal?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, ACT and National both agree that New Zealand can achieve parity by 2025 and that we should take all steps to achieve that. And we know that the first steps have been to undo the incredible damage done to this economy by the previous Labor...
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the statement again, the question was again quite straightforward. Is this a goal that's simply aspirational or is it concrete? They're both contradictory.
The Minister shouldn't be answering when he's not been called, because it was a point of order that was being considered, and if the Minister is prepared to assist the House, it would be helpful. The Honourable Bill English, if he could now answer.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, they're both correct, because ACT and National both agree that the recipe followed by the previous Labor government gave us reductions in real after-tax income, a shrinking export sector, a bloated government sector, and put us on a path to the bottom of the OECD ladder.
Supplementary question, Mr.
The Honourable
Speaker.
Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, which promise is more credible, his promise to catch up with Australia or his promise not to raise GST?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, both of those promises were promises